Hello everyone and welcome to Print to the People. I'm Toby Rampton and I'm going to be hosting this Lino workshop for you today. So this is a really simple video that you can do from home on your kitchen table. I'm just going to jump straight in, start talking about what the process is, how you can do it and how you can print loads at home. So for all of you that don't know what Lino is one of the most basic methods of printmaking, but it's incredibly diverse. It's basically go through the method of having a solid block that you then carve away the surface so that you leave a raised area that can be inked and then transferred onto paper repeatedly so that you can create an entire edition of artwork. So for example, I've got this soft cut bit of lino that I previously just cut with a design, so you can see that I've removed some of the top area and then this was transferred onto paper once it's been inked and it's now left to print. So this is a really basic concept that you can use for this, and you can be as sophisticated with it as you like or as playful and as loose. It's incredibly diverse, so it's good to just get stuck in and practice without putting too many restrictions on yourself. So I'm just going to run through the materials, how each of them work, and there's going to be information in the description on where you can buy these and how to use them too. So I hope you find all that helpful. But if you want to know more information about this, please read the description below, because this is quite an open-ended pool of information to do with these, but I'll run through some of the standard tools and some of the beginner tools mostly. So to start with, you're going to need a lino block. You can easily be faced with a bit of a problem with this because there's quite a few different types of lino out there, and especially if you're shopping online, you might not be able to distinguish the difference between each block that you're choosing. So as a rule of thumb, the standard normal lino will come as a grey block, or sometimes a brown block, which is quite a sturdy, rigid piece. It's very, very firm. It can be quite stiff and tricky to cut, especially in cold temperatures. So usually I'd recommend heating this up on a radiator or with a hairdryer, just to make it easier to cut if you do choose to use this. It holds really fine details, but again, if you're a beginner, you might find this just takes a little bit too much elbow grease. So this is why I use some of these other blocks that I've got here. Soft cut lino is great for anyone who really struggled with cutting with the grey lino but still wants to get stuck in and cut for an entire day. This is a synthetic material, so it's not technically lino, but it is still smooth, flat surface. It's very easy to cut down to size, very, very easy to cut. The downside of this is some of the fine details can be a little trickier to cut compared to the grey lino, but the difference is quite minute, so I'd recommend starting with this, if anything. But today I'm going to be working with sort of midpoint between the two blocks, which is this Japanese vinyl lino. So this one comes double-sided, has a green side and a blue side, and sandwiched in the middle. It's very tricky to see there, I'll try and do a close-up. There is a slither of black vinyl inside of there. If you can't see that, I'll just take another picture. This one's really good because when you're cutting through the coloured layer, you can see the black that becomes revealed, so you know how deep you're cutting. When we're going to be cutting our blocks, we're not looking to cut all the way through the block. We just want to remove some of the surface. So having that black in between can make it really easy to tell if you've cut deep enough or if you've cut too deep. So this is my go-to with this. So I'm going to be cutting an A6 size block that I've got prepped here, which is quite a nice small size to start working with. So once I've decided on my block size, I'm going to need some A6 paper just to sketch out my design so that I know it fits onto my block. I'm going to need some tracing paper so that I can transfer my design onto the block. I'm going to need some paper for printing. Ideally you want paper that's bigger than the block you're printing. So I've chosen A5 paper, which is one size up from A6. I've also got some newsprint, which I'm going to be using for taking rubbings of my lino block as I go along. You can use just any thin paper, even just normal copy paper can do, but newsprint, because it's so thin, can get you a better detail while you're working with this. I'm going to be using a soft pencil, so I've got a 6B here, but you can use anything from 2B to 6B. As long as it's a soft pencil, it'll work absolutely fine. I have a permanent marker, rubber, just in case there's any mistakes, some masking tape, just to help us hold the block in place when we're transferring our design. I also have a little bench hook, which you don't necessarily need, but this can help when you're cutting. So next I'm going to run through some of the cutting tools. There's two different shapes of cutting tools. There is a U-shaped tool and a V-shaped tool that we'll be using today. These are really important that you're using both tools when you're cutting your block. They come in a whole range of sizes though, so generally if you're just popping down to an art shop, you're more than likely going to scoop up something like this, which is just a standard plastic handled tool usually with an interchangeable tip so that you can put different blades into the handle. You can pick these up really, really cheap and they're really good for just getting started, having a play around. They can be a little bit blunt, so they do take a bit of elbow grease to get working, but they're still absolutely essential if you want to get started with cutting your block. If you want to spend a bit more money, you can get tools like these, long-handled ones with these sort of mushroom-shaped tips. These cut through lino much more smoothly, but you are going to be spending a lot more money if you're going to get a selection of these. But as long as you've got at least a U and a V-shaped tool, you will be able to follow this video through very smoothly. I also like to use these Japanese wood engraving tools. These just have a fixed wooden handle, and because they're wood engraving, they're really, really sharp. So these cut through the lino like butter, which is just what I like to use if I'm cutting lino all day long. So as well as those cutting tools, you're also going to need a few bits for when you're printing. You're going to need a roller for applying the ink. You can get different types of rollers. I've chosen one that's got a really thick padded rubber head, but you can get some with thinner heads. I prefer the ones that have got much more of a thick roller, just because I find it easier to apply ink onto the corners of the block. You're also going to need some printing ink. So I use Caligo Safe Wash inks. These are also known as Cranfield. These ones are really, really good for home use. They are made from much more eco-friendly oils, like vegetable oils, whereas a lot of industry standard oil-based inks will need to be cleaned up with white spirit and different chemicals. So this is much safer to use at home, especially if you're working on your kitchen table. These wash out with just a bit of veg oil and hot soapy water, so it's really, really easy to use these. Recommend a whole bunch. You can get them in small tubes or in tubs, depending on what your price range is. You can use a knife to scoop out your ink, or a little palette knife if you've already got some painting tools around. And finally, for printing, we're going to be using a method called burnishing. You can use a burnishing tool for this, but personally, one of my favourite methods is using a wooden spoon or a metal silverware spoon. Either way, anything that's got a dull, soft-edged back will work. And the way that we're going to be using this is that we're going to be rubbing on the back of the paper to apply pressure between the block and the paper to transfer the ink. So that's the general idea behind this, but because this is something that's so accessible at home, it's just really easy to use one of these, and I always find that I get really good results. So you don't need a massive printing press for this. Just a spoon. It's as easy as that. So I feel like I've covered all the tools here. I'm going to talk through them in more detail as I work through this different process, but there's also more information in the description if you wanted to look any of this up at all. So let's get stuck in. Okay, so next I'm just going to explain a little bit more about the cutting tools and how they work with the lino. So I'm just going to pop down a little wooden block here that's just going to protect my cutting mat. You don't necessarily need this. Just doing this. So I think it just makes everything a little bit clearer for the video. So I've already pre-cut some marks on this block. One side is using the V tool and the other side is using the U tool, the ones that we just talked about earlier when I was talking about the different pieces of equipment you can use. So generally the V tool will be used for cutting finer lines, varying width, to help you get detail or to help start when you cut out your block. You'll want to start defining shapes. Generally you'll be using your V tool for that. And your U tool, that has the much larger gouge shaped blade, is used for making much bigger marks. So this may not be too clear just yet on the block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a rubbing of my block using some newsprint and our soft pencil. So as I take a rubbing, you should start to see how these marks will look in the final product, just to give you a bit more of an idea of how we're designing for this. So you will notice the text is backwards as I rub through this. That is because everything is reversed when the block is printed. I'll cover this a little bit more in the design stages, but it is something that you'll need to consider from the beginning. So even though my text is backwards in this rubbing, it won't be backwards in the final print. Whenever you're taking a rubbing, it can pick up a little bit more of the background than your final print will, but this gives you the best idea of how things are going to look. So this is great. Nice U-tool and V-tool marks there. So hopefully this is very clear for you guys. You can see how I've cut different shapes and how the marks will look at the end. So I'm just going to show a few cutting techniques along the bottom using each tool. So you can use these, and I'd recommend practicing on a block yourself and just getting to grips with some of this, because it's best not to overcomplicate things when you're first starting out, because it can take a bit of elbow grease to cut into a block and everyone works in slightly more heavy-handed or light-handed ways than everyone else. So this is something you're going to have to get a feel for just by getting stuck in. So I've got a V-tool here, and I'm just going to cut some more marks down the bottom. So I'd always recommend holding the tool along your index finger. No matter what shape tool, I'd always use my index finger so that I've got a bit of leverage here. And then I'd wrap my hand around so that the end of the tool is then butted against the palm of my hand. So then I can turn this around and use the pointed edge of my tool to then start carving. And then I can get a really nice flow by dipping my wrist and raising it. I should be able to cut into the block. If you don't want to stab in deep, you just want to scoop. Scooping is the best way of going about this. Okay, so I'm just going to start at the bottom here, and I'm just going to go roughly sort of 30 to 40 degree angle, and I'm just going to gently press down. Hold my block and push the tool along. You can see I'm just carving a gentle line out, and at the end I'm just going to drop my wrist to scoop the end of that line. So you can see I've got a really nice sharp straight line there. Just going to take a rubbing of that too so you can see that. Ooh. There you go. I'll just cut this line just here, so that's how it will look on the final piece. So when you go in to cut, make sure you're not stabbing in like this, just scoop. And then by going in deeper, you can cut a much bigger line, like this. So varying your width changes everything. Even though you've got one shaped tool, you can cut in many different ways. Now, a few handy health and safety tips for when you're cutting is it's always good to keep your hand behind where you're cutting. You always want to cut away from yourself. These tools are really sharp. You definitely don't want to be holding your tool in any way like this, cutting towards yourself. And you don't want to put your hand here to hold your block, because when you go to cut and you come out the end of the scoop, your tool is going to jump and you could really risk lopping off something quite important there. So please keep your hands behind your block, hold a corner, and cut away from yourself at all times. That's really important here. So another handy tip is how to cut corners. Oh, I've got a little bit stuck in there. So if I wanted to round an edge off or cut a circle, it would be quite difficult if you're not cutting towards yourself, because you'll find your wrist won't naturally bend around, you'll get quite a wonky line. So actually it's good to rotate your block. Keep your tool cutting away from yourself, but rotate the block. So if I want to cut in and go away from myself and I want to cut a curve, I'll keep pushing away and twist the block. Until I cut a curved edge. This is really good to practice as well, because they can come out quite wonky to start with, but it's a really, really handy trick to learn, is how to cut a curved edge. Practice a few of these different marks yourself, take your time, try getting a few different widths and marks, but getting the hang of using a V tool to cut lines and outlines is going to be really, really important for this. So I'm just going to have a little go with a U tool here as well. So by using this tool in the same way, this one's got a ridiculously long handle, so it's a bit more tricky to work with, but still holding it in the same way, gripping the tip of the bottom end of the handle in my palm and running it across my index finger with a nice firm grip, so that I can still do this scooping motion. So you may find with U-shaped tools that they can be much tougher to work with than the V-shape because they cover a larger surface area. So do work within your means with this, but if you have a sharper tool, this is much easier. So you can see already I'm getting much broader lines on this. So this is really handy for scooping away large areas. If I wanted to remove an entire block, I can just keep scooping like this until the surface area is removed. Again, I can work with small scoops, big scoops. I can get loads of different marks in here. It's really fun to play around with these tools. Watch your fingers. You can be a bit more careful than I am. I'm kind of just hacking away. So also, you may come to a part in any design that you've done where you just want to cut a small circle, something I get asked every workshop that I do. I always find cutting a small circle can be really tricky if you're using the V tool. It depends on the size of the circle you're doing. Say if I wanted to cut a small circle around that size and completely remove the inside, I'd rather just go in with the U-shaped tool. And instead of trying to, I could just try and do a small scoop like this to try and take out a small mark. This takes a little bit of control. It can be quite tricky to finish. You can see I've scuffed quite a few edges there. So a better method is to raise your wrist high, dig your tool in. So this is a very different posture than if we're cutting a line. And I will rotate the block. So I'm just pushing into the block. I'm not trying to do more work than it'll let me. Just letting that naturally come out. Got a few flecks on the end there. Look at that. Just by digging in and twisting the block so it pivots around the tip of the tool, created a little circle. Let me just take a rubbing of these so you can see what I've been doing. A bit more clearer. So, taking rubbings is an incredibly handy thing. I've got my curve there from earlier. Let's see what we've got. What have we got here? So, when I talked about those bad circles that I cut earlier, you can see I have scuffs along the top end. Kind of makes them look more like raindrops. Obviously not a great circle, but this circle where I've dipped my tool has come out fantastic. I've got some really nice marks coming on here, scooping an area out, and some varied lines with a curve too. I'd recommend just getting stuck in, trying a few of these marks yourself, just so you can figure out what sort of level of design complication you should be working with, but I'd always say keep it as simple as you can. And just play around with mark making.